I'm Danielle Evans. I'm the Community Preservation Coordinator for the City of Medford, and my job is to staff the Community Preservation Committee. So, next slide, please. I'm not sure if you know about the Community Preservation Act. You probably do if you're here, but it's a state program that enables communities to allocate funds for open space and recreational land, affordable housing, and historic preservation. Communities have to opt in, and Medford adopted the CPA in 2015 in the general election, and they opted to do the 1.5% surcharge to the property tax bills, and there's a partial match from the State Community Preservation Trust Fund. The Community Preservation Act is carried through by the Community Preservation Committee, which is comprised of 9 members. So 4 are at-large members, and the other 4 or 5. Then there's the statutory members, which are from the Housing Authority, the Conservation Commission, the Community Development Board, and I believe the Parks Commission. I believe I got them all. Next slide. So the way it works is that Medford property owners are have a surcharge on their tax bill, which goes into the Community Preservation Fund. And then you have, as I mentioned before, the State Preservation Trust Fund, and the monies that go into that are from fees from the Registry of Deeds. And the state legislature also has the ability to allocate funds, and presently there's a lot of lobbying going on to find additional funds to go to the trust fund, as because this trust fund goes to all the other communities, and as more communities have adopted the CPA, the match has dwindled. So in the beginning, if you got in early, you got as much as a 40% match. But this year it was 17.2%, and we expect that will go down now that Boston is in the game. So we're hoping that through some of those efforts that the trust fund will find some additional revenue sources so that our match can be better. Next slide. So for FY2018, the second round, our expected CPA revenue is a little over $1.4 million. And state law requires that we designate 10% to the 3 eligible project categories, which is open space and recreation, historic preservation, and affordable housing. So that 10% is a little over $142,000, and the balance would be so 5% goes towards administration, which if we don't use rolls over and can be used for projects, but we don't use. And then $25,000 we have dedicated to small grants, and I'll talk about that later. And so in the undesignated fund pot is $903,622, which we can allocate to the different project categories. Next slide. So what we had heard from the public input process when developing the community preservation plan was that folks wanted to see basically an even allocation of the CPA funds across the 3 categories. So it also depends on what kind of projects we receive, but the goal would be to try to award grants of a little over $444,000 for each of those 3 categories, and then the $25,000 for the small grants. So that is at the beginning of the process. That's what we'll be striving to do, and we'll see how that shakes out for this first funding round, which we haven't completed yet. Next slide, please. So the small grants program is CPA funding requests up to $5,000 with total project costs of $10,000. We had to basically draw a line in the sand of what constitutes a small project, and we decided that $10,000 would be the cap of what would be deemed small. So $5,000 of CPA funds can be funded for that. And there's a separate application process. It's a bit streamlined. There's just the one deadline that's later. You don't have to do the eligibility determination form. and the application's a little bit simpler. And as I said, it'll be $25,000 will be available in this funding round. Next slide, please. So who can apply for these monies? A City of Medford department or division, an organization legally registered in Massachusetts, and individuals. But one thing that is important to note is that individuals or organizations proposing CPA projects on city property must partner with the city and get them on as a co-applicant. And at the stage of submitting an eligibility determination form, all of that upfront partnering needs to have already occurred. We need them to have signed on at that point. And I'm happy to assist and liaise with different departments if applicants are confused of which department they would need to talk to about a potential idea that they may have. Next slide. So the steps are to first determine if a project is eligible. I would recommend that folks contact me. You can email or call, just kind of see if the project that you're thinking about is something that would be eligible for CPA funds. There are some, we're bound by the state law of what is eligible. And if it's a full application, you would submit a project eligibility determination form, and the committee would make a determination whether it's eligible, potentially eligible, partially eligible, or not eligible at all. And we can work with partially eligible projects to see what tweaks would need to be made to make it something that could be funded by CPA. So once you make it through the eligibility determination phase, you would submit your full application, and those proposals are reviewed by the committee. Applicants will need to give a public presentation, and the committee would then make formal recommendations to City Council through the mayor for approval. The City Council is the ultimate decision-making body, and once City Council makes their decisions, we execute the grant agreements for the projects to proceed. Next slide. So this is straight from the plan and also available on our website. It's recommended that you review this table to get an idea if your project is eligible. As I mentioned before, open space, recreational land, historic resources, and community housing are the eligible categories. And on the left-hand side are what are some of the projects that you can do. So you can acquire open space, recreational land, and historic resource or community housing. You can create open space, recreational land, and community housing, but you obviously can't create historic resource, so that's a no. You can preserve all four of those. In the support category, that's only available to affordable housing projects. And rehab and restoration, open space only if it's been created or acquired with CPA funds, which obviously there aren't any since this is our first year, so there has not been any open space acquired with CPA. But you can rehab and restore recreational land and historic resources and affordable housing, again with the caveat if it had been created with CPA funds. Next slide, please. So the way that the projects are evaluated, or whether the projects align with the goals in the community preservation plan, the completeness of the application, whether the projects show comprehensive community-centered multidisciplinary support, the public benefit, short versus long-term kind of visibility of the project, the due diligence, readiness to proceed of the project, whether it's preservation of existing resources versus new development, the lifetime cost and impact of the project, and also the amount of funding requested relative to the funds available and the priority of among the different competing requests. Next slide. So this also comes from the plan, some of the goals for open space, and this is all from public input. Some of the goals are to expand and enhance open space, make Medford Square and neighborhoods greener, more attractive, and to protect neighborhoods and natural resources from the impacts of flooding and climate change. And I won't go into this because you can all read this in the plan. Next slide. The goals for recreational land were to improve access to open space and recreational resources for all residents, expand bike and pedestrian paths, connecting neighborhoods and recreational and community resources, and to provide diverse recreation opportunities serving residents of all ages. Next slide. The goals for affordable housing are to preserve Medford's income and demographic diversity through sustaining and increasing Medford's supply of affordable housing for families, seniors, individuals, and people with disabilities. To facilitate investments in affordable housing that preserve and complement the character of Medford's neighborhoods, and to support low and moderate income households in accessing housing that they can afford. Next slide. And finally, historic preservation. The goals are to preserve historic buildings and sites, protect, restore, and enhance public access to historical records and artifacts, and to increase awareness about local history and historical sites. Next slide. So the timeline for the second round, today first is we're kicking off the second round today with this pre-application workshop. The eligibility determination forms are due on April 13th, except small grants, which don't go through that initial step. We intend for the CPC to respond to make the eligibility determinations by June 1st, at which point applicants would be invited to submit funding applications, which would be due by July 13th. And the CPC will evaluate applications and gather public input throughout the summer, July and August. And September, we expect that applicants would present projects at the community meeting. And the CPC would make their recommendations to the mayor for submittal to City Council, and for the council to vote on their recommendations or for their approval in October. The CPC expects to issue award letters in November and grant agreements executed in the late fall. Next slide. So for any more information that you may need or questions, you can contact me. My information's here. devens@medford-ma.org. The city website is medfordma.org or preservemedford.org. Follow us on Facebook. Any questions? Thank you very much for attending.